Hello and welcome to the Amplifying Scientific Innovation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sophia Ononye Onye, founder and CEO of the Sophia Consulting Firm, a life science marketing and communications consultancy that was established in New York City with the goal of amplifying scientific innovation. The goal of this podcast is to showcase scientific innovation stemming from global life science companies prior to and following COVID-19 from the perspectives of founders, CEOs, and other senior executives who are working on the development of transformative life-saving solutions for patients. My guest today is Dr. Theresa Deisher, President and CEO of AVM Biotechnology, which she describes as a biotech company that provides the software that makes stem cell hardware work optimally for both regenerative medicine and immuno-oncology applications. Theresa's scientific excellence is showcased by roles of increasing responsibility in well-respected organizations, including Immunex, Amgen, and Sound Choice Pharmaceutical Institute, where she serves as president. Theresa holds both a BA in human biology and a PhD in molecular and cellular physiology from Stanford University. It's an honor to have a fellow entrepreneurial woman in STEM on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today. Welcome to the show, Theresa.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Same here. And so my very first question is the most important one, at least in my opinion. What is your definition of scientific innovation?
You know, it's interesting when I think about scientific innovation, throughout the centuries. I think that real groundbreaking innovation typically comes when, let's say, one person perhaps makes a mistake or does something differently, and maybe the same person or another person has the insight to see the results of that mistake. And groundbreaking transformations happen. And there are examples of this not only in life sciences, but in industry in general. The story of sticky notes, the glue just didn't work, right? And someone said, hey, that's kind of cool. And innovations like that are sort of a gut kind of thing. And I've been blessed in my career to be involved in several of those innovative types of discoveries, and it's just a thrill, and an exciting place to be.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I think serendipities play such an important role in innovation, and so it was nice to hear that perspective from you. Now, my next question is a bit personal. It's also a bit professional. What is your most notable accomplishment pre-CEO?
Scientific accomplishment?
Whatever it is that you want it to be, personally, professionally, it's always good to hear it.
Well, I think that the most important thing in my life has been to be the mother of two beautiful and sweet young boys. And they are just incredible young men. I've been very blessed. And scientifically, from my earliest days as a grad student, I've worked on what were considered very controversial topics, really going against, the accepted dogma, but following data and science. And as a graduate student, I worked on beta blockers for heart failure. At that time, all of the experts said, no, you're crazy, beta blockers will kill heart failure patients. Yeah. Well, their standard of care. And it was an exciting time to work. Later in my life, I discovered the first adult pluripotent stem cell. And again, at that time, all of the experts and the dogma said that they didn't exist. And that was truly a serendipitous discovery. I have, been involved, I guess, in controversial topics since then. And it's a thrilling place to be, to follow the data and the hard science and really change perceptions and how medicine is carried out. So
I think that's wonderful. It shows your brilliance as a woman in STEM. I know that your brilliance is probably something you had to fight for, to be seen and to be heard. So thank you for sharing that story. It's also nice to hear about your two little boys, so that's great. What I would love to hear about now is just a top line overview of potential or ongoing work that may be related to immunotherapy and or anti-infectives that is going on within ABM biotechnology.
Well, I'm excited to talk about that. We have a small molecule we call ABM 0703, and this is an immunomodulatory drug. It is a new formulation of an approved active pharmaceutical ingredient, and so has a very rapid development pathway. And what the molecule does at the doses that we give is it mobilizes these supercharged natural killer T cells, cytotoxic T cells, and dendritic cells that are tenfold more potent than the typical immune cells that we see. And we have phenomenal activity against very aggressive, difficult to treat cancers. And by nature, natural killer T cells are programmed to kill abnormal cells, whether that's a cancer cell or a virus infected cell or a cell infected with bacteria. And so we have an approved IND for clinical trials in terminal no option non-Hodgkin's lymphoma patients. And we are moving in parallel to get into clinical trials for COVID-19 because we feel that we could have a profound effect. And actually, as a small molecule that's stable, even at 104 degrees, this could provide a global solution. And COVID-19 is a global pandemic. We need a global solution.
You couldn't have said that any better. I was born in Nigeria, and I think that, infectious diseases have always sort of played a very important role in my life. And thinking about something that it's an oral molecule that has a long shelf life, that is definitely has the potential to be a global solution. So thank you for sharing that. And you sort of alluded to that in your response, but I would love to know, how has COVID-19 changed the way you approach work internally?
Well, we are still working. We actually do quite a bit of remote at times, just because my day starts sometimes at 5 a.m. and ends at 10 or 11 p.m. But our staff are still working. And when COVID-19 first came into the United States, we were thick in the middle of filing our IND for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which we filed on March 13th. As well as several patent applications that needed to be filed at the same time. So working long, furious hours to get that done. And we have always been interested in infectious disease with our drug, ABM 0703. We thought HIV would be the first infectious disease that we would get into clinic for. But with COVID-19, we filed a pre-IND briefing document March 27th. So we got our non-Hodgkin's lymphoma IND filed, turned around and wrote an entirely new regulatory filing.
Wow.
Yeah, got that done. And our non-Hodgkin's lymphoma IND was approved on April 12th.
That is wonderful. I mean, once again, I think that you are always thinking one step ahead, because the next question I was going to ask you is how your corporate social responsibility efforts have changed as a result of the pandemic. But it seems pretty obvious. You all have been working very hard to come up with these innovative solutions.
Well, the mission of the company has always been an ethically driven mission. And our work has focused on reducing demand for unethically supplied medical goods. So, for instance, we can precondition before a cell therapy is given for regenerative medicine, right? And by making stem cells work better, we can have an impact to reduce the global demand for organs and impact black market harvesting, right? So we focus in areas where we see human exploitation occurring in the biomedical space. And by making better alternatives, we can reduce some of those practices. We've always had a mission to make sure that our drugs are available throughout the world, not just in the richest countries, but everywhere. And the intention from day one has been that all of the profits from the company would be put into a charitable organization that would make sure that these drugs are delivered worldwide. So,
wow, I mean, that is admirable. And do you have a specific charitable organization in mind, or just do you care to share more details about that?
well, it will be an organization founded by myself and others of the key people of the company. I've been talking to the World Bank since 2010 about how to do this and other foundations. And there's a local foundation called the Max Foundation. My younger son, I lost to Burkitt's lymphoma.
Wow.
And I'm passionate to get this drug throughout the world because I don't want another mother to hold her dying son. And the Max Foundation has a similar mission. They provide chronic myelogenous leukemia drugs. Pat lost her son Max to chronic myelogenous leukemia, and she delivers these drugs throughout the third world. And it's not just delivering drugs, right? It's making sure that the entire system is there, because even if the drugs are there, if someone has to walk 48 hours to the cancer center, they can't. So you need to find out what is needed in each community and provide that. So, if it's giving financial assistance, if the breadwinner has to be gone for treatment, training local people to give the health care, right? So it's really to be responsive to the whole needs of communities throughout the world.
I think, first of all, I'm sorry about your loss. I can't even imagine that. But what you showcase here is just the importance of public health. Access to medicines are probably just as important as well as quality, of course, and cost. If you think about that triangle of public health. So thank you for sharing that personal anecdote. It's very well appreciated. Now, my next question for you is, thinking broadly, what are some key consideration factors that you believe will be important for sustaining innovation in the life science industry?
For sustaining innovation, I think for innovation in general in our society, the transformation that COVID-19 is creating and the loss of small businesses is a catastrophe. And we have to keep the small biotech, the small businesses who also employ, I think, 60+% of the country and really the world. Is that's where the innovation comes. And we have to make sure that these companies survive.
Right, right. Okay, very well said. And then my next question for you is, any technology or company that you're currently excited about? Like, is there anyone in particular? And it's okay if it's also AVM Biotech, because you guys are really doing some phenomenal work.
Well, yeah, I would like to talk about that. So back in the 1980s, my uncle and MD, Robert Deisher, was very involved in AIDS research. Not only the research, but providing medical care to populations that were being overlooked. And I assisted him in that research. I also was working at Genentech at the time, and they were focused on an antibody to CD4. That was their only focus. And I remember saying to one of the senior vice presidents, "That's the stupidest idea I've ever heard." And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, "Why would you say that?" I said, "Because you're assuming that's the only receptor. Have you looked?" And there has been a blindfold put on everyone, and all they're looking at is the ACE2 as the receptor for the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. Now, the biology of this coronavirus pathology is very different than the SARS-CoV-1, which used ACE2 as the receptor. this virus doesn't cause ARDS. It causes happy hypoxemia. It's like high altitude pulmonary edema. That's a bronchial problem, not an alveolar pathology. And it chronically infects lymphocytes and monocytes. So we have identified a receptor selectively expressed on lymphocytes and monocytes and bronchioles that has as good a binding energy profile to the SARS-CoV-2 spike as ACE2 does. Wow. And we're really pushing, to get that information out there, because if all vaccine and drug development focuses on this ACE2 link, we're going to fail like we failed for HIV.
Right.
So we're in the midst of this. We're working on this receptor and adding additional experimental studies, doing molecular modeling and docking. And I think it is a very likely target and more likely the receptor of entry than ACE2. And I say this for several reasons. If ACE2 were the receptor, then people who take ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers, they have reduced ACE2 levels. Okay, that's a consequence of those drugs. If ACE2 were the receptor, then you would expect them to represent a smaller percent of the coronavirus population than in the general population. But that's not the case. However, there is data that people who have an altered receptor, the receptor that we identified, represent 5% of the general population, but only 1% of the COVID-19 population.
Oh.
Meaning that with that alternative, different receptor, they're not getting viral entry. So we're really eager. We're a small company in Seattle, Washington. It feels sort of like David taking on Goliath. And we've been blessed to have two internationally renowned vaccine experts and infectious disease experts join our board, Dr. Manon Cox and Dr. Gary Groman. And they are really helping us get that attention that we need, at the NIH and the CDC and the FDA. We can't do this alone.
Right.
We need help.
Right. Right. So two things. Dr. Manon Cox, I had the pleasure of meeting her when I was still in Connecticut. She's an exemplary leader, and I can't think of a better person to be part of your board. So congratulations to you on that. And secondly, once again, just from just listening to you, you continue to showcase this outside the box thinking. Like you think outside the box, and you're able to bring in a new way of thinking. That to me is really what scientific innovation is about. So thank you for sharing those insights. My next question for you is more philosophical. For a new biotech CEO that was coming into the office, their first day is today, how would your advice for them be different today versus, pre-COVID-19?
So as a CEO, my advice, so I also have to acknowledge and share that the discovery of the novel receptor and the discovery of our drug's mechanism of action to mobilize these supercharged natural killer T cells was not mine alone. It was in concert with an advisor to the company, Scott McKay, who has absolutely no background in science. He has a construction background, but really thinks out of the box. And so my advice would be CEOs need to know when they hear good advice. And it doesn't matter who it comes from. It doesn't matter if it's an MD with 30 years of experience may not have good advice. Someone totally outside looking at the data from a new perspective was the one to figure out the mechanisms where 54 years of compiled higher scientific education missed it. So it's a gut thing. You have to know, you have to feel it and hear it
Mm-hmm.
and act on it.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my advice.
Well, thank you. Very well said. You never know where innovation is going to come from, right? So, my final question for you is just to open the floor for any other commentary or thoughts that you might want to share with our audience.
So I think, new companies forming now are going to face a real challenge in raising funds.
Mm.
And institutional investors seem to have closed their wallets,
Mm.
perhaps because they're too overwhelmed and they can't possibly evaluate everything coming to them.
Mhm.
So I think you have to have a good story.
Mhm.
You need to be persistent.
Mhm.
And I was talking to an MD investment banker last week, and we sort of started from the typical investment bank position. And by the end of the discussion, he was like, "I am amazed. This is amazing, and your persistence and
Yes.
your insight.
Yes.
You cannot give up." And in my past, I was blessed to be trained at companies like Immunex and Amgen, leading development programs and that's really like even having a 150 person biotech that you're directing, because they do seamless integration. And so you have VPs or directors from every department in the
Right.
company, and you learn from them, and you listen to them. So you gain that experience. But I always did things in parallel. And my people would come back to me and say something didn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. I said, that's fine. Find another way.
Mhm. Mhm.
Don't give up.
Mhm.
Find another way. Do things in parallel
Mhm.
and be persistent and think outside the box.
Wonderful. So this has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. And it's just, as I said earlier, you've done some really fabulous work as a woman in science. And I'm very excited about the future of AVM Biotech. And please, I look forward to staying in touch with you.
I look forward to it also. Thank you for having me on.
It's my pleasure. Have a good day, okay?
All right. You also.
Okay, now, bye.